Hello everyone, this is Dr. Supriya Singh, Assistant Professor in the Department of English, Vasant Kanya Mahavidyalaya, affiliated to Banaras Hindu University. I welcome you to lecture number 5 of week 3 of the course Understanding Deconstruction, a Critical Approach. And the title of today's lecture is Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak, Deeply Informed by Deconstruction. Now, here let us start with the introduction about the critic Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak. She was born on 24th February 1942 and she is still alive. She is an Indian scholar, literary theorist, and feminist critic who calls herself a bricolier. Bricolier is the idea where we go on with whatever identity, with whatever theory is available to us. So she harnesses the theory like Marxist criticism, feminist criticism, post colonial criticism, and deconstructionist criticism, and therefore she harnesses since all these theories in order to convey his idea, in order to prove his point regarding third word feminism. This way, she calls herself a bricolier. She is a professor at Columbia University and a founding member of the establishment's Institute for Comparative Literature and Society. Now, coming to talk of an overview about Gayatri Spivak, let us see that she is considered as one of the most influential post colonial intellectuals. She is best known for her essay Can the Subaltern Speak and her translation of An Introduction to Jacques Derrida's De la Grammatologie. This publication was immediately a success, and the translator's preface began to be used around the world as an introduction to the philosophy of deconstruction, which was launched by the author Jacques Derrida. Spivak met Derrida in 1971, where she was much influenced, and since then we find that, and even after translating grammatology, she has applied various deconstructionist tools upon her works. She has also translated many works of Mahashweta Devi into English with separate critical notes on Devi's life and writing style, notably the books like Imaginary Maps. She has also written the Breast Stories. And after this, as a member of Subaltern Studies Collective, she carried out a series of historical studies and literary critiques of imperialism and international feminism. Here, she engages with subaltern studies, harnessing practical Marxist, feminist, as well as deconstructionist approach. And as I told you earlier, that because of harnessing all these theories, she calls herself a bricolier. Her essay Can the Subaltern Speak, which was published in the year 1988, established Spivak among the ranks of feminists who consider history, geography, and class when thinking about women, where she hailed as a critic who has feminized and globalized the philosophy of deconstruction. Her seminal work, A Critique of Postcolonial Reason, her seminal work, A Critique of Postcolonial Reason, published in 1999, explores how the major works of European metaphysics, for instance, of Kant, of Hegel, and so on, tend to exclude the subaltern from their discussions as well as actively prevent non Europeans from occupying positions as fully human subjects. So, this way, she comes up to present a very unique idea where she is not just talking from the side of the post colonial marginalized subjects, rather, she is also discarding or dismantling the idea developed by various radical feminists as well as philosophers or other theorists in order to prove her point. Now, she is a deconstructionist critic, as we have discussed just now. So, let us see that how her work is deeply informed by Derridean deconstruction, where she applies it with a distinct political and post colonial twist. She used the terms or tools of Derrida, but not in the same way. The way Butler used the similar tools in order to prove her point in feminist criticism, in the same way, Spivak used the Derridean tool in order to apply it upon political and post-colonial approach. Doesn't just play with the instability of language for its own sake. Rather, she uses it to interrogate power structures, especially those related to colonialism, gender, and global capitalism. Now, coming to her language and translation, the very important or seminal work of Spivak is Derrida's translation of De la Grammatologie, which, according to Spivak, is of grammatology. That included a long critical preface where she clarified and even questioned the aspects of Derrida's argument from a feminist post colonial lens. So, this way we see that it is not just a translation, rather, we find a critical space in it. We find that she criticizes, she analyzes, and she finds various blind spots in the Derridean of grammatology. So, this is not just a translation, rather, she added a critical preface to it, and instead of translating it, she added her commentary also to it. So, this way, Derrida's deconstruction, when focuses on how meaning is unstable, how texts undercut their own authority, Derrida's deconstruction focuses on how meaning is unstable, how texts undercut their own authority, etc. But Spivak's worry is somewhat different, that deconstruction alone doesn't account for material histories of oppression because there is colonialism, patriarchy, and race, and so on. So we have to uncover, we have to explore, and this way, exploring all these issues is not something that is an easy task. So, deconstruction alone would not be able to do with it. Rather, we have to explore, or we have to take recourse to the Marxian theory, to the feminist criticism, and so on. She asked, if everything is textual play, where is the place for real suffering? This way, she is talking of the various marginal acts, the various little acts which are never displayed in the wider perspective. And therefore, when we are talking of textual play, when we are talking of something on a wider perspective, we should also look into the little issues. And this way, she comes up to her essay Can the Subaltern Speak, where she critiques both Derrida and Foucault for not accounting for the voices that are structurally erased, for not accounting for the voices of the marginalized, the distorted, and so on. According to Spivak, the center is always deferred. So the colonized, the subaltern, are doubly deferred by the West as well as by the patriarchy. And therefore, we have to work a lot in order to amplify their voice. But what Foucault, Derrida, and Deleuze are doing, they are not amplifying their voices, rather, they are speaking on their behalf. They are speaking on the behalf of these marginalized, these erased women who are deferred doubly by the West as well as by the patriarchy. So they are in the double bind of colonialism and patriarchy, and therefore their voice is something that is quite suppressed, and it is a difficult task to speak or to let them speak. And what Derrida, Foucault, and Deleuze are doing, they are not amplifying their voice, rather they are speaking on their behalf, and this way they are naturally going to escape many little histories and contexts of these marginalized women. So, this way, deconstruction doesn't prevent the reinscription of authority. Example, West always interpret the non-Western other, exerting a form of control or giving a voice to them in their own way. So here she seems to repeat the idea of feminism displayed by Virginia Woolf in A Room of One's Own, where she says that there are texts, there are books, all the books by men, and they are talking of women. So it is only that women would be able to come up with their real original stories when they would write, but they are being written by men, and therefore they are giving voice to them not understanding their original voice. And here, in the similar way, she is talking of the colonized women, the third world women, where they are not just erased under patriarchy, rather, they are doubly marginalized, doubly suppressed because of patriarchy as well as because of colonialism. So, imperial power to present them or represent them in their own way, reducing what they actually are. Now, coming to the deconstructionist technique that she has used, we can see that she talks of reading against the grain, strategic essentialism, and epistemic violence. And we'll be dealing one by one. So, when she's talking of reading against the grain, Spivak emphasizes that reading texts against their dominant surface meaning is something that is to uncover silences, erasure, and power structure embedded within. Because always there are silences and erasures which we often skip. So, Spivak emphasizes that reading against the grain means reading a text against their dominant meaning in order to explore and analyze the gaps, the aporias, the silences, and the erasers. She often destabilizes texts, revealing the ideological blind spots, especially in supposedly progressive or emancipatory discourses. For example, in Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Mahashweta Devi's stories, etc. Now, coming to the idea of strategic essentialism, we see that it's a strategy, not a truth claim about identity. Strategic essentialism is a concept that has been coined by Spivak to describe a political tactic where marginalized groups temporarily essentialize themselves. That is, they present a unified, simplified identity in order to achieve specific political goals. Though she critiques this kind of essentialist thinking, yet she sometimes argues for its temporary strategic use, which is quite important. For example, in feminist or anti colonial solidarity, this shows a flexible political engaged form of deconstruction. Now, here she want to say that strategic essentialism is gaining an identity for temporary basis so that we can sort out something politically, and after some time when the issue gets sorted out, we should leave this essentialistic identity. Thus she uses Derridean tools but applied it onto the structures of colonialism, patriarchy, and capitalism. Unlike many Western deconstructionists, Spivak grounds her analysis in real world inequalities. Her critique is never just textual, it's ethical and political. She forces readers to confront the limits of Western theory when it tries to universalize itself. Now, coming to the idea of epistemic violence. Epistemic violence, which means that there is a dominant knowledge system that led to the erasure or distortion of the voices of the marginalized. So here she want to convey the idea of how the dominant knowledge system talks about the marginalized, they speak on their behalf, but they do not allow them to speak. And this way, they escape so many little issues that are there being faced by the marginalized, but they present them in a controlled and filtered way in the dominant system or the dominant platform. So Spivak thus introduces the idea of epistemic violence, which refers to the harm that is being done when knowledge system itself erases or distorts the voices and experiences of the colonized. She argues that Western intellectual and colonial discourse silences the marginalized voices, particularly those of colonized women, by imposing dominant ways of knowing and interpreting reality. And this is what she terms as epistemic violence. Spivak even refers to the critics like Michel Foucault, Deleuze, Jacques Derrida, in order to critique them for failing to recognize how even radical Western theorists reproduce the silencing of subaltern voices. For her, these subalterns may be a colonized, oppressed subject, especially a woman, cannot truly speak within Western discourse because she is already spoken for by systems of power. So she doesn't say that subaltern never speaks. Rather, she says that when their speech enters dominant discourse, it is always get filtered and distorted by the hegemonic structures. And this way, Spivak comes to the idea that knowledge production is something that is political. Western academia often participates in silencing rather than amplifying the subaltern. For instance, when colonial or Western theory claims universality, it actually violently displaces the local or indigenous knowledge system, presenting Western norms as objective truth. Now, similar sort of concept we will find in his very popular essay, Can the Subaltern Speak? This essay was first published in the year 1983 as a part of a conference volume titled Marxism and Interpretation of Culture, which was edited by Carrie Nelson and Lawrence Grossberg. Now, here in this particular essay, Spivak says that the subaltern cannot speak. When she asks the question, can the subaltern speak? She is actually trying to say that the subaltern cannot speak, which doesn't mean that they are mute. Rather, it means that the system of knowledge, the wider platform of knowledge, is something that distort, erase, or appropriate their voices. Her deconstructive move here challenges the illusion of transparent representation. This means that she is talking when on a wider platform. She says that the Western knowledge system is something that is considered as a dominant knowledge system. And when they claim to speak for these marginalized women, particularly the colonized women, they are not doing a transparent form of representation. Rather, they are speaking on their behalf. And this way, when they present the voice of marginalized women or the colonized women on the wider universal platform, these voices are filtered, and this way they escape what actually these women feel or realize. So this way it is a half or a distorted presentation of these women's life and their sufferings. This way she critiques the Western intellectuals, as already we have discussed. The idea of Foucault, Deleuze, she discards because they are speaking on the behalf of these marginalized women rather than listening to them. Now, further, she borrows the term subaltern from Antonio Gramsci to indicate those who are so socially, politically, and economically marginalized that they have no access to institutional power. Through deconstruction, she shows how the subaltern, the oppressed, the voiceless cannot speak means that they are not heard within the dominant discourses. Spivak challenges the Western feminist theory for assuming that gender oppression is experienced similarly across culture. She critiques feminist thinkers like Julia Kristeva or Michel Foucault because their theories become totalizing or fail to account for cultural specificity. For example, the British colonial rescue of Indian women from sati is not liberation but a justification of empire, framing colonialism as a moral duty while ignoring the agency of the women involved. Now, in order to get the idea, we should discuss it in more detail. So let's see that how the um, idea of sati has been examined by Spivak. So, according to her, she examines British colonial interventions against the colonial narrative around sati. Now, let me tell you that sati actually was a funeral practice where a widow would immolate herself on her husband's funeral pyre. It was a rare and controversial, even in its own historical context. But British colonial rulers seized on it. They trapped this as a moment for justifying their imperialistic rule, and they take it as a symbol of what they viewed as the barbarity of Indian culture. They presented themselves as civilized saviors, stepping in to protect Indian women from this brutal custom. So, this way, they justify that the British colonial rule is something that is saving or protecting Indian women from the barbaric men of India. The British used the abolition of sati to frame their presence in India as a moral and civilizing mission, where they proclaim it as white men saving brown women from brown men. Now, this is something that can be considered as a colonial logic upon which they got a freedom to justify their imperial rule upon India. So, this she considers as a strategy of the white men, how they seized upon this incidence of sati and they took it as an opportunity in order to justify their imperialistic rule. And this way, it allowed the British to justify imperial rule not as exploitation but as a benevolent mission to uplift and modernize backward cultures. Now, this rhetoric distracted from the violence and economic exploitation of colonialism, rather positioning the colonizers as morally superior. And this whole exchange, the British colonizers denouncing sati and thus denounced Indian male, where the voice of the actual woman involved in the practice is completely absent. The subaltern woman does not speak, she is rather spoken about. Her experience is filtered through elite male or colonial perspectives. Even in the act of rescuing her, she is denied subjecthood. She becomes an object in someone else's narrative. This way, Spivak argues that true liberation would require listening to the voice of Indian women, understanding their context, choices, and constraints. The British didn't do this, rather, they instrumentalized women's suffering to gain moral ground in their favor. So, by the end of sati, it cannot be seen as raising voice for brown women against brown men, rather, it was a part of a broader imperial strategy. And this way, British colonialism used Indian women to tell a story of saviors and civilization while ignoring the actual complexity of those women's lives. So, this way, this particular work, Can the Subaltern Speak, prominently or significantly displayed a very new innovative idea where she explored, analyzed, and allowed the marginalized women to speak for themselves. Now, another idea we find here in Of Grammatology, which is actually a work written by Jacques Derrida in French, and this has been translated by Spivak in 1976. So here, as we already discussed, that it is not just a translation, but we can say that it is an introduction with additional commentary upon it, upon deconstruction to basically the Anglophone world. Now, here Spivak performs a deconstructive move in the act of translation, and this way it is a pivotal work. Here she added a lengthy translator's preface, and this way translation here is not a neutral transfer of meaning from the French language to the English language. Rather, it becomes a critical space to open the text to the possibilities that its own language might obscure. So she is not just in the position to translate, rather, she has explored, analyzed, and mediated the idea of Jacques Derrida to the Anglophone people. Now, this 70 plus pages preface is not this way neutral, rather, it is a critical essay where she explains deconstruction not only to the Anglophones, rather to the US academic audience who are unfamiliar with Derrida's philosophical lineage. She places Derrida in conversation with other theories like structuralism, Marxism, psychoanalysis, and even feminism. And this way, she also made him a bricolier, and she also calls herself a bricolier. Now, in this particular work, we find that she unpacks the key concepts of Derrida like difference, logocentrism, and the metaphysics of presence. She critically situates Derrida within Western philosophical tradition. She talks of Rousseau, Saussure, Hegel, and Heidegger, how they harnessed or built his theory upon their ideas. So, this way, she helps the readers grasp not just what Derrida is saying, but how his method destabilizes meaning itself. And by doing so, she makes the work accessible while still preserving its complexity. Spivak is deeply aware of the power dynamics also, which is embedded in language, theory, and translation. And therefore, she resonates with her own post-colonial feminist commitment also. Thus, when Spivak is deeply aware of the power dynamics embedded in language, theory, and translation, she worked upon it and resonated with her own post colonial feminist commitment. And this way, she prepares a ground for post colonial thinkers to use deconstruction as a tool for critique. Now, coming to her next book, a very seminal work, A Critique of Post Colonial Reason Toward a History of the Vanishing Present, which was published in 1999. Here, in this particular work, we find Spivak reaching at its full maturity. Here, she seems to be ambitious, dense, and political in engaging with the theory deconstruction. She analyzes how Western philosophy, literature, and cultural theory have constructed and erased the figure of the third world woman or subaltern. Spivak's core deconstructive move here is to interrogate how major philosophical and literary texts, often seen as progressive or liberatory, participate in epistemic violence. Now, what she want to say is that there are certain texts or philosophical works that seem to be liberatory, that seem to be progressive, but they are full of epistemic violence because though they claim to speak for all, they claim to speak for the subjugated and subaltern, but the way they are speaking, perhaps they are erasing or distorting the voice of the subaltern. So, this way, she gives the idea that those thinkers or philosophers or even literary texts which talks of the idea of feminism, those who highlights the idea of feminism or they are representing such issues, they actually are undermining the idea where we find erasure of the other, erasure of the colonized, erasure of the marginalized. For instance, this is very much prominent in the philosophy of Kant, Hegel, and Marx. And here we see that she particularly reads some of the canonical thinkers like these three, not to cancel them, but to show how their system depend on exclusion of non-European subjects or women. They are actually speaking about the biases that are there in the European countries, but they are giving voice to them, and this they are doing at the cost of the colonized, marginalized, the other, the subaltern, and so on. So, this way, she rejects the idea of these so called liberating thinkers and philosophers, and she comes up to deconstruct their notion of universal subject, revealing how it silently codes European male bourgeois norms as universal, particularly in his idea of the transcendental subject, where she indicates towards a rational, autonomous being capable of moral reasoning and self legislation, excluding colonized, racialized, and gendered others. For example, the non Western cultural practices are often framed in Kantian terms as either not yet rational or pre modern. And even when we come to Hegel, we find that Hegel justifies colonialism by suggesting that Europe actually helps in bringing other parts of the world into historical consciousness. So, this is again a form of epistemic violence where they are talking or speaking in a liberatory way for the European cultures people, rather, they are doing this at the cost of the non European or the other. Thus, this subaltern is not only excluded from the conversation but used to confirm the superiority of the Western historical development. When she comes to the literature, she talks of that how there are certain literary texts or narratives where we find that these narrative coherence of Western identity are often dependent upon the silencing or the disappearance of the colonized figures. For example, when we go through the novel of Jane Eyre, according to Spivak, a novel written by Charlotte Bronte, we can notice that here Spivak rereads the identity of Jane Eyre, where Charlotte Bronte has presented her as an individualist, a feminist, but according to Spivak, she is a feminist and individualist, but at the cost of another figure called Bertha Mason, who is a Jamaican Creole. So, this way, here you will find that the apparent feminist or individualist text seems to suppress another woman who is decolonized and the one who is from a non European country. So, this way, we will be dealing this text in the fourth week, where we will be going with the um, practice or application of the theory of deconstruction, along with various novels, short stories, and movies. We will be discussing this novel also in detail at the time. Till now, I would like to request you to read the text White Sargassoti and Jane Eyre as an homework so that it would be easy for you to understand the next lecture. Thank you.